Restaurant Unstoppable. What the most successful restaurateurs know that you don't. And with excitement, allow me to introduce to you today's guest. She is the proprietor of Caswell's Restaurant Group, which consists of Saya Kitchen and Bar, Brian Oyster, Crudo, and Chops, both located in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and Oak and Rowan, located in Boston, Massachusetts. Nancy Batista-Caswell, are you feeling unstoppable today?
I am, Eric. I am.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I'm so excited to have you back on the show. Nancy was episode 13.
I know.
And you were
Crazy.
such an incredible guest. Really great conversation. A lot of emphasis on just developing people, giving people opportunity. You really focus on your people, and I love that. And I know that's going to come out in today's conversation. Warning, I've come a long way as an interviewer. Nancy was great. Whenever I listen to those interviews, I just cringe at myself, but it's definitely worth listening to. So today, let's get that motivational, inspirational ball rolling with a success quote or mantra. What do you got for us?
I'm still going to stick to everything that I've kind of built on since episode 13. And I'm still a firm believer that, especially in this day and age too, like, you know, we've just got to like fail fast and move on, essentially, you know, like you can't let things rent space in your head, and you ultimately have to learn from those experiences that we're all kind of going through the day on.
Is there one experience that you're reflecting on specifically that I should make note of? We can unpackage later.
You know, I guess so. I mean, I've let some people kind of come and go out of our restaurant group that I kind of wished that maybe I invested a little bit more time in, or, you know, and I've always wanted to circle back with them and bring them back in some fashion. I find myself doing that now with some of the chefs that have come and gone as we are in COVID, and ultimately a lot of people are looking to have in-home gatherings. I'm trying to call back those people and see if they want to reconnect and do a dinner, and maybe fill their tank as much as it would be to fill my own with having them around.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's definitely been challenges where I just kind of was like, okay, they're not with the group anymore and they're moving on. And then there's a point that I've realized, like, I've missed that person as a part of my life. We let a lot of people into this business and they become family, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it really, at the end of the day, I think business is just about relationships. And I think we forget that it's just a way to manage relationships. That's all business is, right?
Oh, yeah.
So absolutely love that focus on relationships. But where does it make sense to start telling your story? So the first time we had you on the show, we kind of just shot some questions at you.
Yeah.
We're going to slow it down today. We're really going to pull back the layers on who Nancy is. So when did you know that this was your path, that this was going to be your career?
You know, I fell in love with the grind of the front of the house business. And that was, you know, pretty early on. I started in this business in a donut shop. My parents immigrated here in 1979 from Portugal. I feel like it's in their blood to also be hospitable and genuine and host people.
Yeah.
Restaurants were a big part of my life growing up as just a pastime for my family, but also my mother cooked in a kitchen as a second job for her, and I, you know, sat in stock pots and watched her after school. So I definitely have had the restaurant business in my blood since, you know, very early on, as long as I can probably even remember. I remember eating kale soup in Portugal and hating it, and now it's one thing that I love, right? My mother actually jokes with me on that. But yeah, I just, you know, I feel like I started early on, but the grind definitely came to me when I worked at the Back Eddy. I was in college, and I was a food runner, hostess, and then Chris Lessinger was basically like, you know, why don't you consider managing? And he didn't even know how old I was at the time. I was 19, and I went for it.
Nice. So Chris Schlesinger is somebody we got to hover over a little bit. I like to say behind every great restaurant is a great person, and behind every great restaurateur is other great people who help create that person. Was he one of these people that really influenced who you are today as a mentor, or what was that relationship like?
Yeah, I think the whole organization at that time definitely showed me the way. You know, I had grown up in kitchens that were definitely more culturally influenced. You know, they were Portuguese restaurants that my mother was cooking in. And so to have the exposure to somebody like Chris in a more casual setting like the Back Eddy, there were certainly a lot of moments where I could reflect and think, okay, like if I ever were to open my restaurant, I want to do something like this. And there's still moments in his management style that I still embrace now when working with my people. So, you know, I think the biggest thing for me was that Chris was a chef in the kitchen but he very much had a place in the dining room, and he very much understood the challenges of running the dining room. I find that that's a difficult thing for chefs right now, and probably something that they're finding a little bit more, anxiety about in the moment of COVID.
Yeah.
But, the idea of being present in the dining room, either having to talk to your guests, being vulnerable about that feedback, or just being able to do the job of somebody in the front of the house is something that a lot of chef owners will realize quickly when they open their own restaurant, that they either don't have enough experience with or want to learn it.
Yeah, I think I want to unpackage this more real quick. Who is Chris Schlesinger? I'm always afraid to say his name.
Chris Schlesinger. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So Chris Schlesinger is, I think he's like 6-time or 7-time book author. Specifically more focused on grilling for sure. He's been a part of several different restaurants and has such a great relationship with so many other chefs as well. But I think most of us know him for the Blue Room. Then we also know him for East Coast Grill. We know him for the Back Eddy in Westport.
Yep.
And then he did a short stint with Dave at the Automatic, which unfortunately did close during COVID.
Dave
Cagle.
Okay.
And then he's, I think, just kind of on the sidelines now. But just a great, talented chef.
I know he was like James Beard, like the mid to late 90s best chef Northeast. So, definitely somebody you want to go work for and learn from. Absolutely, right? Are his restaurants still around to this day, or?
No, I don't. I mean, the Back Eddy's still around, but I'm sure he still spends some time consulting on it, but he's not a partner on that project anymore.
He started as a restaurateur almost 40 years ago.
Yeah, for
80s,
sure. Yeah.
So back to your original point of finding that balance between the back of house and the front of house, and engaging with your guests. And we started this interview saying that it's all about relationships.
Yeah.
And I think we forget that we make it about the food sometimes, and we forget that it's about the person that we're serving the food to, not necessarily the food itself. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
I do. I think that it's so important for people in the dining room to have a voice, you know? And I think that in a time where competitive cooking, I think even we're going to talk a little bit about COVID, right? And I don't want it to just be about COVID, because hopefully at some point we're going to get through this. But I think that's
that for the end.
Yeah. I think that the challenge really is right now that people are, they want creativity, but they also want a full understanding of what they're going to be getting, right? Because the value and the expectation of the experience is definitely something that guests are driving right now. And so chefs typically who are more creative and more competitive in their style cooking can find themselves very much making food that, stimulates them. And in return, we have to educate the front of the house staff to make sure that the guest fully understands it, So there's a little bit of, eating a slice of humble pie at the moment and trying to be everything for everyone to a certain extent, but trying to fill our own tanks at the same time. And so I find that the people in the front of the house are super important to the business, not only because of the steps of service that they're offering, but really because they are like the billboard for, the chef and what we've got going on.
Yeah, I'm going to go into a little bit of a rabbit hole and pull back a layer. You mentioned the significance of educating our staff.
Right.
What does that look like for you? When you're adding a new menu item to your, offering, what does that look like, that process of educating your staff look like?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you that it's been challenging at the moment right now, because typically we used to find ourselves very much focused around training and education. We used to fill our Fridays or Thursdays with a staff training. We used to calendar that time, whether it was bringing in vendors that spoke to their own products, or, wine reps that spoke to their own, bottles of wine. We would kind of hold our management accountable for creating some kind of training flow at least once a month, if not twice a month, due to the challenges now that we're facing, and the limited staff. It's been really hard. And that's been the part that's like, trying to maintain morale and trying to continue to, have those one-on-one moments with your staff to educate them or get them excited about a product is hard right now. But I think in our Boston location, our chef there, and all of our chefs really, Mikey and Bree and Andrew, they do such a great job of very much creating a dish and then sitting around a table and talking about it, whether the dish continues to evolve, whether it's missing something. And that's really fun for me to watch because it's definitely a collaborative focus on the dish that brings it together and allows people with a little bit more sophisticated palate to truly know where chef is going with it.
Yeah, what's that conversation look like? Kind of paint that picture to see what a good constructive conversation should look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that basically it comes with them, like, they'll always talk about the plate up, right? And so they put the dish together. I'm sure on the back end, they're especially right now dealing with vendors and trying to see whether or not they can procure items and how long it'll be available to them because that's been challenging. But so they put the dish together, they plate it, they kind of taste it together. The chef behind it seems to identify the ingredients and where they were going with it. And they taste it, and sometimes it's a total success with moderate tweaks. Sometimes it seems like they just want to scratch it after they run it as a special or for the weekend. But once it gets put on the menu at this point, it then goes to staff pre-meal, and then it's fully discussed. At that point, our management team creates a menu spec on it. It gets circulated amongst the team through an online scheduling app. That's kind of been our form of communication, especially right now. And it gives them the details that they need for the dish.
See, this is why I love the pull back layers, because we're starting to get into like the systems and the process and how to communicate effectively. So after it goes through the process of, and you say, okay, we're going to make this a dish, you create a menu spec, which is basically like what the ingredients, the story behind it, any important information about the purveyors, stuff like that.
Allergen related things. Yep.
And then real quick, what does the lifestyle, or what, not the lifestyle, but the life cycle of that spec look like? You said you create the spec, and then where does it go?
It goes onto a scheduling app that we're using. That's a basic platform for all of our communication.
What are you using?
We use 7 Shifts.
Okay.
We've been with them from the beginning.
By the way, 7 Shifts, I think as of maybe not this episode, but the episode that goes live on Monday is a current sponsor.
No way, that's amazing.
We did not plan this. I never plan these things.
Yeah.
I love when my guests organically recommend the companies that are
I almost felt like we were like a beta with them. Like, we've certainly tested the product out. We've liked the way it's grown as a form of communication that makes it easy for management, but also just, the importance of being able to shut off when we walk out of the restaurant is huge. And so, for staff to not feel like they just have to be texting as a form of communication, it's a nice way for management to be able to have their own outlet to check in on staff and communicate through that vessel.
Nice. Okay, so this menu spec goes into your scheduling. It gets pushed to everybody. Where else does it go? Anywhere else?
It doesn't. I mean, at that point, it then goes up on, walls within the restaurants just to make sure that if somebody needs just reaffirmation during the shift, that they have a place that they can go to on it.
I love that we're getting into this nitty gritty so early out of the gates. I have to remember that we have your whole story to share. Yeah. So let's bring it back to the timeline. Any other lessons Chris taught you? Any like business lessons, life lessons? I don't know how significant he was in your life or not, but
I mean, I think that he taught me a lot in the sense of, not worrying about who's in the dining room and treating everybody equally within the dining space. He also taught me a lot about how to have fun in the dining room. I feel like that's been a challenge for me personally. I take my job pretty seriously, and so at times I'm challenged to make the space feel fun. It feels like, there's an expectation to be created, and sometimes I'm not as probably fun as some other restaurants could potentially be. But, he kept it fun, and he kept it light, and he kept it exciting. And for that, he had certainly built a tribe around himself where people stayed for a very, very long time, and he had a strong regular clientele. And for that, it's taught me a lot about how to keep those connections alive.
I love it. So what else do we need to know about your story, your come up? And I know you went to Johnson & Wales.
I did, yeah. I went to Johnson & Wales. And so I left the Back Eddy after graduating, essentially. I spent one more summer there, and then I realized, I shouldn't be collecting unemployment as a college graduate when I don't have the choice, when I do have a choice to not be doing that.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, I think at the moment I didn't realize what the transition would be like for me, but then now looking back at it, I realized, wow, that was a perfect pivot for me. I started to work for a developer, Stephen Karp, for New England Development, and that brought me here to Newburyport. I essentially started to learn how to project manage construction, and I started to see restaurants from scratch. And in a corporate place like New England Development, it really exposed me to many different layers that sometimes you don't see with an independent restaurateur, like budgets and, you know, capital expenditures and capital budgets, and really the pipeline of, you know, how you get things done.
So
and
you went to Johnson & Whale for hospitality
business management.
Business management.
Yeah.
When you joined New England Development, were you going with the intention to learn about how to develop restaurant spaces? Was that the idea, or was there any intentionality behind that?
You know, it was. I found my voice there. Interestingly enough, and that, I guess, set the tone for what I would become.
You found your voice there. What do you mean by that?
So I came with I came to a restaurant here in Newburyport. So first of all, I fell in love with Newburyport because it's like Westport, right? It's another port, a waterfront access. And I came to a restaurant that had been recently purchased by their organization, and it was failing, and only in a way that it was failing because it hadn't seen any love in a long time, and I think that's their interest in probably purchasing it.
So New England Development purchased the restaurant because it was failing, and they were basically just seeing it as an asset that they could
bring to their portfolio along the way. Yeah. So right now, Steve Karp owns a significant amount of Newburyport, Michael's Harborside, where a lot of the real estate, where like Tuscan Sea Grill is now, the marinas, a good amount of State Street. He does not own the buildings that I am in currently, but he does have a big investment, several millions. In Newburyport.
So you joined this team. Were you thinking you were going to get out of hospitality, or is it just a coincidence?
It was just a coincidence. Okay. You know, I was coming out of a headhunter who had read about me, and I kind of didn't really know what I was getting into, but I decided to jump on board to come to Newburyport. I moved to Salem, Mass, and I basically started this little restaurant. I worked in it as they had purchased it.
Okay, so this is after you're working for New England Developers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you timestamp this for me? Where are we?
We're in 2005.
Okay.
We're in 2005. I graduated in 2004, and so and to be honest, I guess I should say that I was hired to run the restaurant, but I knew that Steve Karp was the developer that owned it.
And forgive my ignorance, but Steve Karp, is he the owner of New England Development?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Mm-hmm. And with that, so I worked in this restaurant. Again, it was charming. It was 10 Center Street, and it was essentially just tired. It needed love. It needed a little TLC.
And this is Salem, Massachusetts.
This is here in Newburyport.
Oh, where was Salem?
I just moved there.
Oh, so you were from Salem, you moved to Newburyport. Okay, I got a little turned around there. Yeah. Gotcha. Okay, so 2005, you opened your first restaurant, 10
Center Street.
10 Center Street. Okay. I feel like there might be some lessons we can pull from working with a developer, especially one who focuses on restaurant commercial space. Mm-hmm. It's safe to say, right?
Right.
So what were the biggest lessons that you learned from that experience, opening and developing, and what exactly was your role there?
Right. So basically what happened was they hired me as a restaurant manager. I worked for a couple months before we started diving into budgets and really having responsibilities with financial control of the restaurant. We were sitting there kind of talking about a lot of the nickel and diming expenses. The reality, in my opinion, was that the top line just was struggling. And so in a conversation around the table in one monthly P&L meeting, like I said, I used my voice, and I basically said, what we're sitting here doing is just nickel and diming certain expenses, but the reality is the top line is what's suffering. And so I kind of left the meeting thinking, I think I just lost my job, because why would they need me?
When you say that the top line's suffering, really break that down, the specifics of how and why it was suffering.
Just the sales behind the building, all of it in general. We were one of the largest restaurants here in Newburyport, and we were only filling a small capacity of it on a nightly basis, and that was just basically what was known to the town as Molly's Pub. And everything upstairs was, really just there was no intention behind, going up there or dining up there. And it was, I think a project for them that they probably realized was going to need to happen at some point, but I think I just accelerated it a little bit.
So was it a volume issue?
Yeah, it was a volume issue. It was also just, a little bit off the beaten path. And, I honestly spent so much more time focused on the future of it that I didn't really dissect what it was. I know that it was certainly a nostalgic spot for many people. I know that they had so many different celebrations there, and people had a lot of family memory there. But, I took that into consideration when the organization New England Development came back to me and said, if you can create a restaurant, what would you create? And, we pitched a business plan, and I got into my first project management role. So
how old are you at this time?
I was 23 years old.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And wow. I loved the chef at the time. I really did enjoy him. I didn't want him to go anywhere. I believed in his food. And we went into this project and, we built a bar upstairs. We invigorated the whole second floor. We got to the point where we found that the second floor was just really just, everything we needed it to be, and thought that the first floor then needed some love. Like we were going to scrap the whole idea of Molly's Pub. And we did that. And, at that time, it was very much a restaurant that I think set the tone for Newburyport dining in that way. And I've met some really incredible people. And during that time, I found myself just falling in love with the community and falling in love with the city. And that's what led me here today and how I have restaurants here.
Yeah, I don't think in my 700 plus interviews that I've ever come across somebody who has entered into the industry through a development channel. Like it's weird because it sounded like your trajectory was very traditional, but then I've never seen anybody get into that development side. But I think that's so important.
Yeah,
because it's one thing to run restaurants; it's another thing to build and develop restaurants. It's a whole nother set of skills and expertise.
Yeah, and honestly, and that's some of the calls that I do get from colleagues and friends in this industry, because what ends up happening is, they hit the glass ceiling in their restaurant, whether it's they've been the executive chef there for so long, or they are been a restaurant manager for so long, and so the next step is to naturally either open your own. Yeah. But if you don't have the exposure to some of the budget stuff that you do see sometimes with development, that becomes a concern. And then the second piece is the idea of construction. Like we know what we love, we know what we do, right? We know how to put great food on a plate, we know how to serve our guests, but how do you learn how to get all your applications, and how do you learn how to, manage a construction site? And then I think that's oftentimes where you hear a lot of restaurants are going into their, opening with a lot of debt or additionally incurred costs that they weren't planning on managing.
That's the other thing too. I think people, they have this vision for what they want their dream restaurant to be, and they think that they have to achieve that on day one.
Right.
And like they don't scale into it slowly. They don't build a team around themselves to execute it, and like all these things. I'm really curious, what was that transition from being on the development team, right, to them handing you a restaurant and saying, make it your own?
Yeah.
How did that work? Like, did you own it at this point? Were you a
No.
partner? Like, what did that look like?
I was just their manager.
Okay.
And I think that for me, I think about it now and I think about, wow, again, I didn't think that was going to be the progression of my career. But then looking back at it, I realized, wow, that really taught me a lot.
Yeah.
And I was so scared. I mean, I was 23 years old, and I was like, I just told them like their restaurant isn't going to succeed. Yeah. And they're like, okay, like go manage a construction job, and you're like, create a budget, and you're like, wait a second, hold on, this is crazy. But I find that I mean, I think that ultimately at the end of the game, that project led me to a place where I learned a lot about myself, and I realized that I am very capable of an overflowing plate, and I can most of the time get myself out of it.
Okay. How do you manage your plate, your overflowing plate?
Yeah.
Give us some of the things you do for like time management, project management. What are some of the tricks?
So I'm pretty organized when it comes to my schedule, and as far as like my time goes, I realize that there's definitely been peaks and moments. I'll take into consideration like even like Oak and Rowan's opening, and I realized I really wanted to do a restaurant in Boston. I had 2 restaurants at the moment in Newburyport, and I am thinking like, how am I going to be everywhere all of the time, right? But it certainly came down to being a part of the team and having the people that I did have in place to be able to begin to stretch and do a third location. But, personally, I've always felt like my time is always spent like on the floor talking to people. And so that's what I enjoy doing. And I wanted to make sure that I could find the way to get it done. There's been times in the last like 4 years with Oak and Rowan where I haven't been able to find the time to be in every restaurant.
Yeah.
That's been tough for me, and certainly a challenge that I've needed to overcome, about whether it's, trusting the people that I have or building different systems where I can still get the level of communication that I need.
Yeah.
I mean, I live here in Newburyport, right? And I've said this from the beginning, like the last thing I want is to be standing in a Marshall's line and getting feedback about the dining experience they had last night.
Right.
And not knowing if that was positive or negative because I don't have the communication.
Well, I was curious about that because your first two restaurants that you owned personally were Saya, which is across the street, but you guys moved that original location, didn't you?
Yeah, so Saya actually was here.
Oh.
I found this location after leaving 10 Center Street and the development company, and I took like 2 or 3 months off, and I found this location on the internet, and I didn't have a big budget, and I opened Saya here.
Okay, so I guess what I was saying is like, the point I was going to make is you went from having 2 locations, like literally across the street, like little diagonally across the street from each other, to having a third location that's a 45-minute drive with no traffic. Right. And like it's hot, like that. When you can be across the street, you can be like if you have to run across the street, you can. But now you got to get in a car and go 45 minutes. Was that a hard transition? Should we wait until later to talk about this? I kind of feel like we're getting ahead of ourselves.
We might be getting ahead of ourselves, but honestly, I mean, I think that I'd say yes, it was challenging, and I think that for a lot of people who either listen to your podcast or ask me about it, the idea of opening in another city or even another state has its challenges for sure, and it's really about you as a business owner and how you can handle it, and what things you might need to give up and what's most important for you.
I'm going to put this on the back burner because I think there might be some great lessons you can give us on how to juggle those things and systems you can put in place to juggle these things, or how to build people up so you can recreate yourself and others. I'm sure there's some advice around that. But back to what we're talking about, you learned a lot. You said you learned so much about yourself at 10 Center Street. 10 Center Street. You learned that you were capable of handling these big projects. What else did you learn about yourself?
I thought that I was pretty resilient. Like, I thought that, I knew the job and I knew how to get it done. And I think that I can see a job through for the most part, like from start to finish. I don't give up on it necessarily quickly. I feel like, I'm not going to just quit at it. I'm going to see it through. And if I fail at it, I failed. But like, I'm going to see it through. Yeah. And, I saw that restaurant, which is something that I think a lot of restaurateurs and chefs see, those first couple months of when you put so much work into the construction piece of it, and then it's like blossoming. You're like, wow, this is the moment, right? Yeah. There's that like too deep at the bar, and you want to jump on the bar to help the bartender to put out drinks. You want to, get on the line on the kitchen and expo with them. You want to get on the door and greet the host. Like, there's just that moment where, you look back at it and you think, how did I do all that? But you do. And it's weird. It's so weird that we can do it.
Absolutely. On that note of looking back, hindsight being 2020, being the seasoned restaurateur you are today, you're talking about a lot of the things you learned about yourself or what you're capable of, but knowing what you know, what would you have done differently? What were the areas you could have definitely improved on back in the day that you reflecting back at that time?
I mean, I think that I guess I lead by example in the sense of my intentions, like I want the conversation and the culture of the restaurant to be all about food and wine, and I want it to be about service, and I want everybody to get along, and I want it to be organized, and I, hope that our expectation is that way. I think that sometimes the people that were around me might have thought like maybe I was, taking advantage of their time a little bit and saying that like, you have to have trainings every week and you need to be a part of this and you should be arriving early if we're going to have, X amount of people on the books. Like, getting to connect with people alongside of me that still thought like this can be my life, but it doesn't have to be my whole life. And that's something that I've, even learned now during this time, like my restaurants are my life, but they can't be my whole life.
Yeah. So your big struggle then was finding that balance, and still to this day is finding that work-life balance. What else?
Well, I realized quickly that I definitely wanted to do the job for myself. I thought that, oftentimes I was working myself, and not just in a way physically, but also emotionally and spiritually, where, I was really, emptying my tank on the creative piece. I was putting every different idea that I possibly could into it. And at that time I had met my husband, who very much would tell me, if you're going to work this hard, you should consider working this hard for yourself. And sometimes you need a partner like that to truly understand what you're capable of doing.
Yeah. So when did that he planted the seed? When was that?
It was in 2009.
Okay.
And I was getting to a point with the restaurant here where I'd been here for a long time. They had made some changes in the structure. Not that they were necessarily negative.
When you say here, you're talking about this physical space we're in right now, Brian?
No,
okay.
10 Center.
I was going to say, I'm getting confused. Okay.
Yeah, no, 10 Center. And I I was at the point of basically like, it's time for me to move on. I always felt like I was with my restaurants for like 4 to 5 years. I feel like that was the time I needed to spend, Even right now when I interview people, I kind of am surprised. I'm like, how as a general manager did you leave an impression on that restaurant if you're only there for a year? Like, it takes so much time to really dig in, So in that case for me, I'd been there for like 4 years and I was ready.
So what did you get from this experience that you think, if you could narrow it down to one experience that had the biggest impact during this 4 years developing and growing 10 Center Street, what's the thing that served you the most to this day?
Well, I guess I'd have to say that just digging into the community certainly helped me the most. And I learned that was a big part of what we need to do in restaurants, because restaurants are a big part of the community. And
that's huge.
Yeah.
What was your approach to digging in?
I tried to be a part of every organization I could. And at that time, which is still happening, it still will continue to happen, is the idea of, charitable events, or the connection to, being somebody who can be on a board and assist in a different organization in any way.
Can you give me some examples of some of the organizations that you were looking at as this would be a great organization to be a part of?
Yeah, I mean, I still even sit on them now, but I was like one of the youngest corporators for Anna Jake's Hospital here. I sit on the YWCA. I've participated in the Jeannie Geiger Crisis Women's Center. We've done quite a bit with Our Neighbor's Table, which is a pantry in Amesbury. And we've certainly made relationships with some of our key guests in the dining room, because they also support those organizations as well.
What kind of commitment are you looking at with these organizations? Like owning a restaurant in itself is a huge commitment.
Yeah.
And then giving so much of yourself to all these different organizations. What advice do you have for first, being intentional about which ones, strategic about which ones you want to be a part of,
right? And
then also managing all that.
Right. Early on, when I first opened Saya here in the space that we're sitting in, I got this advice from a PR company that I was potentially about to bring on. And she said that, you need to make sure that you also share who you are in the restaurant, because that's the admiration that your guests are going to have, for you. And, initially we thought we would design it around being female, something that was education based, and we would have this kind of philanthropic mantra or interest in how we would invest. But, restaurants get hit up left and right for a couple of different things, and so many different chefs participate in many different organizations. In my commitment to Newburyport, the interest in being on all these boards is really just a place that I think fills me more than actually they probably even get from me, to be frank. Here we are in COVID. We fed, I think, 1,400 meals to the nurses at Anna Jake's Hospital during that time. And the community got behind us, and we, I think, raised like 600 burgers for the nurses at some point for them to come and get the Saya burger. So, I think overall, it's challenging for sure. Sometimes, I'm sitting on a 6 o'clock and a 7 o'clock conference call, because most of the board members don't have the commitment of work at 6 or 7, and I've got an earbud in my ear listening to a board meeting while I'm still trying to be on the floor.
Yeah. So was there any like intentionality of like, if I like, not to say that we're joining these groups to be a part of the community. I think that's really important that people don't forget that you're not just doing it so you can say like, it's not you show up, you take a photo, look what I'm doing, and then you leave, right? You have to be a part of it.
Right.
But was there strategy involved, or was it just like where help was needed?
It was just more like where help's needed.
Okay.
And I think that myself, I'm definitely somebody who like runs to the fire, right? Like I definitely want to fix a problem or help as best as I can, or be a part of some kind of solution to the problem.
I love it. But absolutely one of the biggest lessons I've learned is you have to either go to where you have roots or create roots where you are, and it takes effort and work to network and to find those people and to just to be a part of your community and not just leverage your community, like you have to be a part of it.
Right. And I mean, like, and we try to influence and impact our staff to do the same, like we want them to find their own personal outlet. Like, we want them to feel good about supporting these organizations. In Boston, some of our previous chefs, already had their own organizations that they supported, and that was fine. They can become a part of what we do too. But I think it's important for, individuals on a whole, whether they're in this business or not, to find a philanthropic way to understand nonprofits and how they work and how they benefit people. Yeah.
Take us to the point where you really started living intentionally to develop your dream, your vision for a restaurant. And it was your husband put the seed in your head, you said, right? So take it at that point. Like, what did you start doing to live intentionally to execute that first restaurant, Saya?
So basically what I ended up doing was I started to dive into menu creation. I mean, I think that restaurants are food, service, and atmosphere, right? And so Saya was in, as we are in right now, it's kind of blended right now because of COVID, but, it was small, it was intimate, it was brick exposed, it had the beams, and for me, I just felt like, okay, like, I think we should be doing like cheese and charcuterie and pastas and focus on like maybe Spanish and Portuguese cooking, because I knew a little bit about that. I also feel like restaurants, again, going back to the community conversation, is like if we can be more collaborative as opposed to being competitive, then ultimately we have more of an opportunity to succeed and survive, right?
I love that mentality. I think a lot of people get in trouble and they think that, I have all this competition, but those who work together go further together. You can go faster alone, but you go further together.
Right.
So where were those collaborations? What were you talking about?
Well, we started talking about, okay, well, how much money do we actually have to put into furniture, and like what was already here, because it was for the most part a pretty key turn, like a location, and the restaurant that we were taking over was raw vegan, which was way ahead of its time. It probably would have been very successful now, right? That's like 11 years ago.
Wow.
And so we started to look at, okay, like where's our money better spent? Like, we've got some furniture stuff we need to work on, but we have a really beautiful bar. At that time it was Copper Bar, and but the kitchen had like nothing because everything was like dehydrator based. Yeah. So that was where most of our money was going to be spent, and so we started to think about, okay, if the money needs to go into the kitchen, then how does that translate to the guest? Because the guest doesn't know how awesome a stove is, or the walk-in that you have. So we started to build on the menu piece and what we needed first off for equipment in order to succeed at executing it here in the restaurant.
So what was appealing about this physical space? Why was this a good spot for you? What drew you to it?
Again, it was still very nostalgic. It was like that place where, like, I'd heard over and over and over again about Scandia, which was one of the top restaurants in Newburyport years and years ago. Billy Joel and Christy Brinkley.
Right,
had dined in the front window, and like they had all this.
It's
like
such an
love
interesting front window too.
Yeah.
Even Jared was pointing it out when we were walking in, that like it's just like not symmetrical. It's like a little like he's like, that's such a weird window, but it's charming.
It is, and it really, the energy in the space when it's small and intimate is really what gets people excited personally, right?
Yeah.
And we can, in larger restaurants, try to achieve that by like turning up the volume a little bit and dimming the lights a little bit, or like paying attention to how you seat in the dining room, so there's like natural energy in certain areas. But the larger the restaurant gets, the more, concerning you have to be about how do you create the atmosphere and that level of.
But you did mention that there was a failed restaurant here. were they closed, or were they looking for an exit? Like,
they were a combination of looking for an exit, but at that time had basically announced closing.
Okay.
And they were very short-lived, like 6 months. They also suffered some, personal, I think, health issues as well. And so, I just looked at it like it was the right time for me.
Yeah. I guess what I'm getting at is, were you somebody's exit strategy? I think that's such a great way to get into this industry, because sometimes people just get in, they have a vision, they have an idea, they go to execute it, and it doesn't stick, you know, for whatever reason it might be, and then they're stuck and they just want to get out. They're like, we tried, it wasn't right, and now we just need an exit strategy. And if you can be that exit strategy for somebody, if you can be their way to recover, I mean, was it like that at all? Or,
I mean, I'll be honest with you, they put the restaurant on Craigslist. I bought it on Craigslist. Think about that transaction.
Crazy.
Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy.
Back then was like people were just like learning about Craigslist. Now it's crazy. Like an everyday thing. But I mean, so I guess so. I guess that they were probably in a place where they were like, I gotta dump this quick.
Yep.
I mean, they had a long lease ahead of them.
Yeah.
But to me, the things that I loved about that space was really just like I could work this space. Like I was doing, 2 floors in my previous job, and going back to even the back Getty, I was, deck space, outdoor deck, this, outdoor grill, oyster bars, outdoor bar.
Well, you're maybe
inside.
20 strides from the front and back house right here.
And to me, I was like, I can succeed at this because I can hear everything in the dining room. I can connect with everybody. I can hone in on the staff that I have and make sure that they're capable of serving in the way that I want them to serve. And, I was so fortunate to have built, again, a small little group of individuals who followed me to open the restaurant in a very non-competitive way, but in just a way that, they wanted to work with me. And so there was already that familiarity for the community to walk in and recognize the bartender and to know the server and obviously to know me. So I fell in love with the ability to kind of work the space. And even now, till this day, when I do work the space as its brine, it's just a moment of like, oh my God, this is so great. And, maybe one day when I retire, I'll still have a little 30-seat restaurant.
And it is a very charming, cute space. We do have the cameras rolling, so I'll make sure Jared gets some B-roll of the actual space. So how long were you in this physical space here before moving across the street?
So I was here for about 2 years, and so I'd got married, and my husband had the space across the street that he owned. And
so your husband's in the industry too. I didn't realize.
Yeah, I mean, he does all the mechanical and HVAC, and does a lot of construction, and has assisted me in all the projects from this point forward. I actually met him through doing the project at 10 Center Street. And he has become certainly our number one critic. Like he knows what he likes for food. He knows, sometimes I think he's a sounding board for when I'm thinking about, creative, competitive food, and he's thinking just be a little bit more casual and simple. So we made the decision to go across the street because, we were, I guess it's also the challenge that a lot of restaurateurs have. We sit there and we think like we're doing great, so let's grow, right? Versus like, let's just maintain. We want more.
But at the same time, I think you did it right because you did start small. You did start with something that was manageable, where you could be in all these spots with a few strides across the restaurant. You made it small, you made it manageable, and you had something special. You created something special. Let's talk about that success you had in the early years. What was it? Paint that picture of like how the first couple of years went.
I mean, it was wild. It was fun. It was exciting. I mean, Pat Soucy. He was our executive
not
chef.
Pat Saucy.
Yeah. By the way. And he, he filled my tank. He still does. Like we still text, like he was excited about food. He was totally connected with the guest experience. Like if I was putting on a wine, he wanted to change the whole dish completely to pair with it. We were very much a team. We were definitely a team.
He's had such incredible things to say about you, by the way, because I actually had the privilege of working with Pat over at Applecrest for a little while when he was opening that. So really great dude. So it seemed like there was a shared vision, almost like where you guys knew what you wanted, and there was almost a chemistry between the two of you. Was he your first chef, your opening chef?
He wasn't my opening chef. My first chef was with me, Billy, for about a year and a half, and just the business. He hit a wall with the business, and it's not always the most healthy.
What do you mean by a wall?
He started he was a broken person in the kitchen, and the reality was that the hard hours and the long hours, there becomes some issues that somebody personally needs to tackle, their own demons. And unfortunately that happened for us here. We've connected since, and we've moved past that time. Certainly incredibly talented, and he set the tone for what Pat could become in the space. But unfortunately for us, it just was like not the right move.
Yeah. And I mean, we kind of skimmed over like the whole process of opening the first restaurant and the challenges you might have faced that a lot of first-time restaurateurs. Well, it wasn't your first your first owned restaurant.
Yeah.
But what anything you learned the hard way that if you could just let somebody know, like, so you don't make the same mistakes I did. Is there anything like that we can touch on before kind of talking about how you scaled and grew your team?
So I think that I experience it every time I open a new restaurant, and it's the reality of just not being like well rested and mentally there. Like we got to work on our head and we got to work on our health before we launch, and we come out of a construction job and we're getting ready to go. Then we're trying to get all the certificates to get open. Then we're trying to get open. Then we go through the training, and then we're like, let's hope people come through the door, right? And then there's that anxiety of that, and then suddenly you get this influx of people walking through the door. And then you're not mentally there. You're exhausted, because there's just not that downtime in that first year. And then you have the elements that, we've been successful at, that many restaurateurs are as well, where media starts to play a big part of that. And it becomes, challenging. And in all of our restaurant openings, I've been fortunate enough to win some great awards, and I've been fortunate enough to be reviewed by, large media. But that doesn't come easily. It's challenging and overwhelming to think about somebody's writing and telling your story, but it's your story to tell, and it's the same way that it weighs on a chef, in like, well, it's my dish and my vision, and like going again full circle on our conversation, that if the server isn't fully trained in the front of the house, then how does that information in that dish properly get communicated to somebody who's about to tell your story in 500 characters?
Lots to unpackage here. So you said that the challenge was almost like you pride yourself in your project management and your ability to manage all this stuff, but also it seems to be your strength is also your weakness, in the sense that like you can handle it, so you do take it on, but sometimes you suffer as a result of it.
Yeah.
So this is what you've learned. This is what you're trying to tell people to not do, right? That's the original question. So what are you doing differently? How do you take care of yourself first? How are you making sure Nancy's taken care of before her restaurants are taken care of?
I'm still learning and working at this daily, right? I think that we evolve and our lives change even from where we were day one when we first opened a restaurant. And so we, whether we bring new people into our lives and, relationships start, or, and you're forced to, have to think about, okay, how do I do what I love at work, but also, how do I be who I am? Like Nancy isn't just, say, a Brian and Oak and Rowan. Nancy is Nancy. And I think that, I think that maybe even COVID has a big part of that immediate kind of burst to the bubble that we might have been living in, where, restaurants are saturating the market. There wasn't a lot of quality people coming through the doors to execute what we wanted, so we find ourselves even more challenged with training and being more hands-on, because the quality of person working in the space, whether front or back of the house, doesn't have that natural skill set, and we're, paying more for them because we have to, because that's just the market right now. And, coming out of COVID, I mean, when we furloughed the 100 employees that we had to furlough, and it was our off season, because Newburyport isn't booming in March. I felt like I even went through a little PTSD. I went through that moment of like in 11 years, I've never woken up on a 7 a.m. and not had, a purveyor telling me that something's back ordered, or a truck's being delayed on delivery, or an employee who wants to call out, or a shift in something, or a modification to a private event, or like, that communication went dark probably right after everybody tried to figured out how to do unemployment. That was like the end of that,
Yeah.
That was a moment for me when I think I actually brought me to tears, where I was like, oh my God, like my life has been restaurants. Like I don't know how to just sit home. I don't know how to not be on the go all the time. And so with that, in this moment, I've found myself with that, like, okay, I'm not going to immediately wake up and read my phone anymore. Like, I'm not going to immediately make that connection to like social media or whatever. I'm going to slow down a little bit on that.
Hindsight being 2020, I feel like it's kind of like we were so close to it because it hurt so much in the moment because we're like, our lives are crumbling around us. But when we take 3-4 steps back, I think it's almost like a blessing in disguise that we were all forced to slow down and all forced to get a sense of what a normal life looks like, some balance looks like. And like you mentioned, the market was oversaturated, is oversaturated. I think this is going to weed out a lot of people that shouldn't be in the industry. They're maybe in the industry for the wrong reasons.
Right.
And then when we can reopen, should we open more restaurants, or what else can we do with this space that might be better for the community and not like opening more restaurants? Does the community really need that?
Right.
Like, does the market need that? Like, we should ask these questions. And I think that though it might not feel like it right now, like a year or two from now, we might look back at this and be like, we needed this.
Right. And listen, I thought that, like, you know, when the COVID thing happened, I thought I had some kind of training in it, right? Because I worked for, you know, New England Development when the economy crashed in 2008. And so, like, we were nickel and diming that budget like crazy. One of the things I learned at that time was, like, you know, let's just try to expense manage as much as possible. So ultimately, when we come out of this, we already have our budget in place. Because what happens when you open a new restaurant, right? It's like the first year, it's like, go, go, go. You know, I'm filling the hole. Okay, this person doesn't work. I'm going to rehire somebody. I'm going to bring somebody in. I'm going to retrain them. That costs money. I'm going to have overtime. That costs money. I'm, like, you know, not paying attention to how many linens we're using. That costs money. And so all these things where you're you know, peak of your business, you're spending a lot more money at that time. And so I think that, you know, now looking at the business, you can evaluate and say, okay, that was getting away from me. This was getting away from me. You know, that expense is significant. You know, I just had a conversation with our chef about chemicals the other day, like, holy Lord, like the chemical piece, you know? And that's the moment of, like, getting the staff to connect with the expense that they're realizing. In the past, they didn't really care about.
Yeah.
Right.
Are you building systems around all these things? Are you creating new standards and ways to, all these things that you caught and that you kind of, it sounds like you said, like, things that you noticed and that might have gotten out of control or away from you. Are you reeling those back in and trying to create systems around making sure that they don't get away from you again?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, you know, we've had better conversations with our accounting office, but on the flip side, like, we're having really difficult conversations with people that have our most fixed costs right now, you know, our landlords and our insurance guys and all of that about, you know, are we covered for all these things? And more importantly, was the market for our spaces, you know, far too much, you know, money per square foot to be renting, or CAM expenses and all of that stuff, you know? That's the piece of the puzzle. When you go to a lot of large builders or landlords that we're dealing with right now, or just, you know, you're pitching your proposed plan and your goals, you're realizing, like, okay, I think I can hit this number because I'm projecting X amount of sales. But when you're not projecting X amount of sales, but you have certain chemicals coming in for more flow, and you used to do, you know, 2,000 people a week, now in COVID, you're maybe doing 500 people a week. Who knows? You know, you're like, wait, I have to cut this linen expense. Like, I have 15 rugs rolling around in the restaurant. I don't know why. You know what I mean? Like, that's that piece. Yeah, that I think we're all kind of growing our eye towards.
So it sounds like we kind of just get numb to all these additional expenses and we just accept them as necessary. But I think what you're asking is that what's being communicated? Yeah.
I think that, you know, everybody can look at their payroll line now and think, like, okay, is it necessary to have X amount of people on? Like, is there enough work? Or can we use that person to be more versatile? Like, you know, or even just like the element of, you know, large, you know, requirements for case drops, whether liquor or food. You know, it's like, oh, so basically I still have to hit 15 cases in order to get a delivery. Like, this is wild. It's COVID. You know what I mean? And you start to develop those relationships too with people where you're like, okay, if you can't pivot along with us, how can we support you? Right?
Yeah. So we went into a little bit of a rabbit hole here, but I'm happy we did, because there's tons of value coming from our conversation. But back to the story, you're just about to move next door.
Oh,
right? No, I think there's tons
back there.
No, you're just about to move next door. You had built, say, to a successful business. You're getting accolades at this point, recognition at this point, right? Or best of, maybe a couple.
Yeah, we had gotten best of. We had just gotten Rising Star Chefs. Yeah, Pat had one for a chef, and I had one for the New England restaurateur. Yeah.
So how did that impact your business? Was there a noticeable change in business after getting those accolades, or how did that start to shift things?
I don't think that it gave us like huge amount of accolade, just because like suburbia at that point was still not that competitive. You know, not a lot of chefs from big cities were like coming into the suburbs at that time. We're talking about, 2010, 2011. Whereas now I find a lot of chefs are considering the suburbs. But
why do you think that is? Not to go down another rabbit hole, but what?
Probably for the exact same reasons of what we just shared. Rents, landlord commitments, smaller programs, smaller footprints of space, so they're more manageable. I think that a lot of people have moved out of the city. I'm sure even more will move now, and so there's still a quote unquote foodie that's here that respects food, that loves food, and so they can do a little bit of that, and maybe their quality of life will change.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a huge shift. And actually, I had this conversation with Nick Kokanas. We're talking about this. He thinks, and I think that there's going to be some level. I think both is true. There's a huge exodus of the cities right now because it's not safe. It's probably the least safe place to be, is on top of each other. But that will probably go away, and there's gonna be a huge rush back into the cities, but I don't think that will ever be to where we were. I think that the allure of being in the city has probably kind of gone away, and I think that we brought the city to smaller neighborhoods, and like you said, the quality of life is better, and it's easier to be number one in a smaller community than it is to be number one in a massive city, right? So I think that that's good, though. I think it's good that we're spreading out. I think we need to spread out. I think for our mental health, we need to spread out,
For sure.
So worth going down that rabbit hole, but back to the timeline of the story. What happened across the street that you guys saw this as an opportunity? So
Jeff my husband had basically gotten to a point where he was like, I'm not really sure I really want to run a bar. And bars were changing, credit card fees were coming into play, and like, all these things, all these additional expenses that weren't before were starting to become and essentially taking away a hindrance to the business itself. So we had just gotten, like, I remember, like, Zagat at the time was, like, huge, right? And they were, like, just giving us, like, the hardest table outside of the city. And I was like, please don't give me that award, because that means that, like, nobody, or, like, put me in that article, because that means, like, nobody will come to Newburyport, because where else will they dine, right? And so we ended up making the decision that people were asking for things that we could potentially provide by moving across the street, whether it was a larger table for dinner, private dining opportunities. You couldn't really private dine here. Obviously, we're in a very open floor plan, and the largest table we could do was like 8 or 10 people, but that was like, loud. It's loud in here with that. So we made the decision, and Jeff wanted to invest in the building. I think at that time, it needed to be updated and maintained. He owned the real estate. So the investment made sense. Like, if we're going to invest further into Saya, why wouldn't we invest in our own building? So we did that, and we moved it across the street, and I had a team. I had people that were very capable. And when we moved across the street, we dealt with the challenges of 3 floors now and going from 50 seats to 150 seats. We tackled private events. It wasn't with, challenges, but we got it done, and it was another kind of stressful year. But I loved this space, and one of the things that I didn't think I was capable of initially was opening up this kind of raw oyster bar, because the reality was the restaurant was raw that we were buying it from. So I just felt like it wouldn't be enough of like an end to that. People might think like I was just trying to like, change slightly what that menu was. But I certainly had found my inspiration in little oyster bars kind of all throughout. And I thought that I could do an oyster bar. But one of the things my husband brought to me was like, well, what if you don't like shellfish? And like, what if you don't like seafood? Like, how many times do we go to a raw bar to just like eat oysters and then we move on for our main course? Like, or like, and so that's when we decided like, okay, let's do steak and oysters, and like a very small, like bistro kind of setting for the steak piece, and the raw bar being very present. And so it kind of took on a life of itself. And again, with the team that we had, we started to essentially separate and tackle the restaurants.
And that, I'm so happy you mentioned the team, because when you first went into business, you had such a manageable space. You hadn't really developed your team yet. You had hired some people, but you really hadn't put together that team. You gave yourself 2 years to put together a team. Paint the picture of what you said. I had the team. Paint the picture of what that team looked like and what made that team so tight and capable.
I think because we were just all grinding it out together, we just had this natural interest in like wanting to support one another. We genuinely cared about each other's success at that time.
What did you do? What was happening in your business? And I agree, and I think that is magic when you feel like you're in it with other people, when you're in it together. I feel like you just can go so much further. So what was it about what you were doing and how you made it that you created that sense of togetherness?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I think I had a little bit of an infectious way of myself in that time where, you know, I loved what I was doing, and I still love what I'm doing, of course, now, but like, you know, I think it was an energy that I possessed that people, you know, around me started to feel that way. And then when Pat joined the team, you know, he's so incredibly interested in you know, so many different ways in the farming piece of it, and just like trying to speak to guests. And the thing about Pat was like, he was always willing to talk to guests about food and talk to guests about the experience. And the difference between that and talking at somebody was huge, mm-hmm. right? Patrick brought people along for the ride in the dining room with him, whether they came for the burger because they had read about it. He would get them to change their mind and go for like a rabbit dish. You know what I mean? And that was the connection to the piece, the puzzle. And then, you know, he brought along some individuals who, again, wanted to work with him. And along with that came, you know, Justin, who ended up being the executive chef of Brine and Oak and Rowan. But, you know, he had just come to visit some friends in the North Shore and had read about us. And he dined with us exactly where I'm sitting right now, and was like, hey, like, can I do a winter stage because I'm leaving Nantucket? And Pat was like, yeah, absolutely. Right.
Nice.
And then, you know, with that move across the street, we were kind of like, who will come and who won't? And, you know, Jeff and I had a very strong interest in Justin, and we got him to not go back to Nantucket and to stay with us. And he did. And he was a part of the Brine location here, which just, you know, we were very quiet about initially because we were so concerned about Saya's movement across the street and like how large it had been expanding. So like we didn't really go, like we opened Brine maybe 8 weeks after we had moved Saya across the street. And we didn't really kind of announce it to everybody, especially going back to that conversation, media purposes, for I think another like 2 more months, because I just wasn't emotionally there to have people start critiquing us about the move and the changes and what was happening here now.
So when you moved across the street, did you leave this space behind, or did you retain both spaces?
I retained both spaces.
Okay.
I had to make a decision. It's funny. I have a memory of my husband and my brother-in-law who does all the building piece. We opened Saya on like across the street in like mid-January or something like that. We closed for like 4 days just to move all the furniture over, but the space was ready to go. We did like an opening party, communicated the new menu by passing it to everybody in the dining space, and then we ended up like, you know, wrapping up from that VIP party, if that's what you want to call it. And the next morning, Jeff's like, where are you? And I'm like, just getting ready for the day. And he was like, well, I need you at 25 State Street because we're going to start ripping apart this bar. And I'm like, right. And so here's the Carrera Marble Bar. And so I'm like, okay, so we're going. Like, okay, you know. But that was kind of, it was fast, you know. It was certainly like, okay, what am I doing here? But, you know, I believe in the space that we're currently in, even in the moment that we're at right now with COVID and it being a small footprint, and, you know, it only has 8 tables, but there's something pretty magical about this space. For me, it's obviously the start of our business and our organization, but, you know, even from a dining perspective, like it feels safe, it feels homey, and ultimately, you know, for so many reasons, I guess, a chef can succeed here because, you know, it's small, it's intimate, you can see everybody, it fills your tank. Like if you're shucking oysters, you're talking to a whole bar that wants to talk to you about oysters. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
And so that's that level of, you know, really connecting with the guest that I think is a smart blueprint for people to get involved in early on.
I love it. And to go back to like how we got here, talking about just putting that team together and having that team and being able to develop, I always say cash flow and people determine your growth. And would you have had the same success if you went straight over to that space across the street where you were spread out a little bit and you had more people you had to manage and it wasn't as intimate? You know, you got to establish those relationships in a really warm, welcoming, and not to say that across the street isn't warm and welcoming,
Right.
but you got you get to make an impact. And I think it's so much easier. Think about dropping something on the ground. If it's heavy and large but flat, it's not going to make an impact. It's just going to stop at the floor. But
Right.
if you're tiny and skinny, pointy, in the same weight, right, you go so much deeper. And I feel like that's what a small space does, and it allows you to develop those relationships and to bring people on and make it manageable. And then, oh crap, I have all these great people working for me, but there's only so much opportunity. Like, what do? We go next door and we create opportunity, right? Now there's a whole new wave of opportunity. Was that going through your mind?
I mean, it does go through my mind now, because obviously with the Boston location, that's how we got to where we were there. But, in the moment, it just felt natural, and I think that that's the thing with, being a restaurateur or an entrepreneur in general, like having that spirit of basically thinking like, okay, like I'm doing great. What more can we do? Sometimes that can be a lot for somebody, but if you're taking it in a little bit at a time, then you can sit there and say like, okay, we can grow. We could potentially do that. But yeah, absolutely. I think that opening up in a small blueprint certainly helped me create consistency and allowed me to really connect with the team that would allow me to grow and ultimately let me get to know the community even more. I think that maybe if I was like following my steps from being at 10 Center, which was a huge space, and going into Saya, which is now 150 seats, maybe there wouldn't have been enough longevity in me and stamina in me to survive that volume for such a period of time.
Yeah. So looking back now, before we start talking about your third operation, Oak and Rowan, any mistakes you made in the transition over there, or any other things that, knowing what you know now, you wish you could have avoided, or you could help somebody else avoid?
I think that it was a part of the situation. I guess I should say, I don't know if there was like mistakes. I mean, of course, on a day-to-day, like operationally, we always found ourselves reflecting on how to do better, what we were going to do there. But, the challenge of a very vertical building became like masterful. Like honestly, 3 floors, and like what that does on your body and like how you handle, your prep is in the basement. You got to get food to the second floor.
So 4 floors.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the flip side, it wasn't for everybody on the team, and it still isn't. Even when we interview now for people for that location, I talk to them. I'm like, okay, do you talk to me about, a vertical building, like and going up and down the stairs, and like, how do you feel about that? And, the same thing for, kitchen and chefs, the balance of going from 50 seats to 150 seats in very much like a blink of an eye was hard. And there was a burnout to that piece. And then add on private events and what we were doing there, which, we never want to make a mistake when it comes to a guest, right? But like if you make a mistake with a guest, for the most part, you should be able to win them over if you have the right team in place, right? Like if the food wasn't hot or something, or there was a mistake or a misfire, right, you can fix it. But when you're doing a private event for somebody that's rehearsal dinner driven, or like, second wedding or a bridal shower, baby shower, all those things, you can't screw that up. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're just like so connected to that. And it became such a big part of our business there that was just another layer of work that we were doing.
So what advice do you have for somebody who's all of a sudden tripling in size or quadrupling almost? Because how many do you sit in here? 20, 30?
Yeah, we're 47 in here when we can have the bar. But I think we focus on the pros of all the things that we're going to do. Like, right, I think naturally in any business, when you open it up, you're thinking about, okay, I've got this, I've got that, I can do this, I've got this. But you're not necessarily talking about your failures already, right? Like, you don't really look at it and be like, okay, so what will happen if we have 50 people upstairs and then we have the first floor and the second floor moving off of one line? How do we do that? It's not until we do it that we're like, okay, yeah, this is not gonna work. You know what I mean? Now we'll look at it like, is it really valuable enough for us to use the second floor for dining, or should we, write a menu that we could plate half of those dishes on the second floor to execute for the third floor, so the pressure isn't all coming out of this like 750 square foot kitchen space. You know what I mean? Now we have enough experience to be able to do that. But so we made some mistakes initially because we weren't focused on, we just thought we could do it, we can do this. And then you realize, okay, this is not easy, and so I'd say, as hard as it may be in a time where you're, totally stimulated by your potential growth in business, or, you're like energized and, you do have to have those tough, difficult decisions that could say, what can happen if this goes down.
Yeah.
You know.
So it was 2015, 2014 when you opened Oak and Rowan?
It was 2016.
16,
But I
okay.
signed the lease in 2015.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what was that experience like, moving from, Newburyport, a smaller community, to our big city, Boston?
Yeah.
What was that? Any challenges associated with
Yeah,
that?
for sure. There were so many challenges. Well, first off, so many people were approaching me during the period of time. And I think, again, that might change a little bit, going into the COVID piece. I think, back in 2015, the seaport was booming down there. A lot of development was in place, but it became a lot of realtors chasing certain style talent, whether it was somebody who was maybe a little bit more corporate, which we see a lot of the seaport in, with bigger chains. Or there's, the interest of like still trying to find an independent that might have 2 to 3 locations that's already proven themselves. But for me, it was, really trying to figure out the right space and going back to the atmosphere of what that could be. I think that our stories made sense, when somebody came to Brine. It felt like an oyster bar, and they liked the energy here. And if they go to Saya, there's that romance and that old building and the, beautiful ceilings on the 3rd floor and like all of this other sexy, like, moving pieces of the dining room that get you excited and make you let your guard down, And so we were looking at spaces that were like, either still not built yet, or, were very much, didn't have the same charm that we thought made sense for our portfolio. When we finally found the space that we did Oak and Rowan in, I didn't even know it was on the market. We were going for a run, my husband and I, in the city, as we were just kind of always looking at spaces. And we decided on the location that we have. And we had a team again in place. Like, we were ready to move Justin. He was talking about going into the city. I had built some strong relationships with the pastry chef at the time. And we were just ready to kind of like move into something. Now the challenge of that space, as we're in COVID, is that, it's very much business, office workers. And so, while we wanted it to accelerate into being a little bit more residential, it's not completely full. And the high rises there are unfortunately affected by the COVID piece of this.
Yeah.
But, it's been 4 years of like, this would be the time where we would start to really see that nature of repetitive business and more regular clientele and the potential of the GE and like all of that was going into that neighborhood.
Okay. There's so many different things we can talk about,
right.
Between. So you were open in 2016, Oak and Rowan.
Mm-hmm.
What about what was that transition like, going from managing 2 restaurants that were 200 feet apart from each other, 100
Mm-hmm.
feet apart from each other, to now having to make that commute in and out of the city?
Mm-hmm.
Anything change about how you run your businesses to be able to manage that better?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest successes for me in Newburyport was that I secured somebody that I think is like even as talented as I am in this industry, for a front of the house manager, Giselle. And so she's still with my organization now. But, I wanted to make sure that she was like capable of running the floor. Everybody in town already knew her. She had really great energy about herself. And so I felt really comfortable trusting that she would hold the standards that I wanted. Of course, I think it's always really important for management teams to have this natural synergy. When you don't have that synergy, it's like really kind of like, a bump in the road in that sense. Like, I need to be able to talk to you inside the restaurant and outside on the telephone. I need to be able to like connect on so many levels. And so it was important for me to make sure that there was somebody in place here that could do that. And so
When you say here, you're talking about
in Newburyport.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so with that, it just became like, okay, I know that my everyday is going to mean that I'm going to like talk on the phone with these guys more than I'm going to see them. I might not be present every day, but I need to find a way to touch base. I need to find a way to connect with the guests somehow. And, I started thinking about, okay, maybe I can do these specific dinners that let me connect with people that I have been seeing in our restaurants for years, so they still don't feel like abandoned and they're,
So hosting specific dinners, like with the intent to keep connected. Okay.
Like our wine dinner series that we're still even doing right now during COVID, like that's a moment for me to connect with people that I know for a long time, and give them the reassurance that I'm here.
I haven't forgotten about that.
Yeah.
Right? So when you were about to make that move or about to expand into Boston, was there anything that you did to your business to reinforce systems or processes to recreate yourself in other people and in systems and processes to be able to ensure that it would stand without you there all the time.
Yeah, I mean, a big part was actually shifting electronically to like even 7 shifts, you know. It's like I no longer could write these schedules by myself. I no longer could manage everybody's need for a request off time. I couldn't, you know, be on my phone responding to a text message. I needed to have that all kind of centralized for me.
So what was that? How did you... What were the most significant? You mentioned leveraging more technology. What were the other systems you enforced or
we went
replaced?
to a management meeting on a more consistent basis.
Okay.
You know, pretty often enough, I was just like in the space always. So there was really no need to have constant, like creating another meeting after another meeting. So a big part of that was just like, okay, let's start using a way to manage one another and have that, you know, monthly connection.
So it was a monthly connection. And what did that connection look like? What did that meeting look like?
For the most part, I tried not to run it personally. Even with like all the questions that I would had, I tried to have them come to the table with their own questions or like their own feedback. We started to review P&Ls. I thought it was really important that the company run pretty transparently. I think that it would be important for them to be able to identify like our expenses, our losses, and how they were managing them. They would start to build a sense of ownership in that way. And, you know, we went through the ups and downs of it because not every restaurant runs at a positive, you know, cash flow on a month to month, you know. So sometimes they got the emotional like, oh, man, this sucks. We're down significantly this month. And it would be like, OK, like, well, what are we going to do for next month? And then they had that personal interest of creating their own events that just weren't created by me. And, you know, planning to do dinners or paying more attention to how to, you know, do something for someone, or we can take on another private event, or maybe let's think about a themed dinner.
Yeah, and what you're talking about right now is the great game of business and making it a game and realizing that there's these numbers, and so if we track these numbers, what gets measured gets managed is something I love to say, right? And then bringing people in on that and like letting them know that they can influence the numbers by how they show up and the things that they do to get creative to impact these numbers. I love it. What about other systems that you might have tweaked or improved or reinforced?
I mean, I'm not sure I did that much more after that, to be honest. I mean, I'm sure that the team themselves probably started to create their own ways of doing things, like, you know, their own ordering of their bar inventory and stuff like that. But like for the most part, I still stayed relatively connected on a day-to-day basis to be able to help or, you know, make a decision.
Is there anything we haven't discussed up to this point regarding your journey, lessons learned, things that you do exceptionally well that you think contribute to your success that's worth bringing to the surface before we kind of talk about the future, how you plan to evolve for the future, if anything? Now's the time to get it out.
I just say I document a lot, you know, like in anything that I've done. Like I was always kind of taught to do that, you know, so it's like I try to pay attention to, you know, every wine that I tasted. So like right now in this moment, I can't really meet with a rep to taste any wine. So I'm trying to go back on things that I've tasted over the last 11 years and be like, okay, I remember this wine. Like it's so good, you know? So I think documenting has been huge, and like just creating the process of like making sure that we continue to communicate and, you know who and where, like somebody's in the dining room and what regulars we have and
what are the things that you document that you think most other restaurateurs don't that they should document?
Oh, I'm not even sure. I feel like I document, I mean, we manager log every single night, but I think every restaurant does that now, to be honest. Like I try to document our sit downs with my staff. Years and years ago, we used to call it boxing, like sitting down and like going back and forth with an employee who could either provide with positive enforcement on something, like something they felt was valuable to the restaurant and they could get it out, or in a way that they were like being destructive or toxic in the dining room, that we could have this one-on-one conversation to identify an issue, as opposed to like being very black and white that was like, you know, written warning, verbal warning, fire, right? Because progressive discipline is so important. Now it's like, you know, can we talk about something I'm noticing in you in this weird shift? Like, is there something going on? And like I'm documenting it, but it's not like a formal way of documenting.
This is huge. Progressive discipline. Get into that. What is it?
So progressive discipline is, you know, the way we're taught is in a way to basically try to be as black and white with an employee as we possibly can. And it's really hard in a restaurant business because there's so much gray so many times, right? And it's also very much how and when the timing of this, you know, action happens. So it could be like a very vulnerable state where somebody like misbehaves or does something ridiculous on the middle of a crazy shift. It could be a call out on a very busy night. If the call out happened on a not so busy night, would we have the same reaction?
Yeah.
So in that way, it's very important to have this progressive discipline form in a way that's just like, okay, that's a written warning. This is a written warning. And, you know, the next one could lead you to termination, right?
Yeah. Why is it so important to document these things?
Well, it's important, I think, for both ways. One is to cover yourself personally in management, you know, unemployment, filing and all that stuff. All the unemployment insurances start to rise on you if you have people that are always claiming. It keeps our management in line too. Personally, the way I see it from somebody who's managing managers now, it gives me a way to understand where they're at with their staff. If I keep reading a couple comments in a manager log consistently about a particular employee and they're misbehaving or their mistakes or whatever, my follow-up to that conversation is like, should you have a sit down out of the time in which they're doing the action in a way to correct the problem, and then putting them on notice about it.
Yeah, it forces you to communicate. It forces you when you make it a part of your operation to say if this then that. If there's an issue, then there's a follow-up meeting. Then it forces you to get these things out. 'Cause sometimes you might notice it if you don't have these systems put in place. Then it will get away from you. Maybe you never communicate that this person is doing it wrong, or maybe they say that you never said anything.
Right.
Which now you can protect yourself from wrongful termination or anything like that. Right? So there's a track record saying we communicated, there wasn't progress made.
Right.
And like you said, it's important for them to know where they are because people want to know if they're doing right or wrong. They want to know how they're doing.
Right.
So you need to set up that time to let them know that they are doing it right or wrong. It's huge.
Well, and, during the time prior to COVID and when there was the saturated market, we were very much looking as management at ourselves and critiquing our management style, right? Like kitchens can't behave the way they did in the past. That, demeanor has to change. The culture has to change in so many ways, right? Like, but specific to management, culture needs to change. And, the expectation that we have for our employees could be different than they thought that they were going to be expected to perform to.
Yeah.
And so, if there's so many inconsistencies and then worries because we were shorthanded. So we were shorthanded going into a shift, and then you're kind of just left with this place of like, well, if I give this person a written warning, will they walk on me because there's no loyalty, and in return that sets me back even more, right?
Yep.
So it became this kind of fearful transaction between somebody in management to an employee, because you were like, does this make the situation better or worse, and where does it put me, right? And it becomes very selfish in a certain way, where you're like, I can't manage that person. But it does get to a place most often than not that it bites you in the butt, because then you're like, oh man, I should have terminated that person when they no-showed 2 weeks ago, but I wasn't busy. Now they call out because they think they can on a busy weekend night, and my whole team's affected, and I'm the one that looks bad because I gave them the benefit of the doubt, right?
Yeah. Nancy, I've been loving this conversation. You've been dropping gold on us.
Yeah.
You really have. And I want to make sure we leave time to talk a little bit about what you got going on with Mass Restaurant United, what we can do going into the future. I think this election year is going to be really important for the restaurant industry, especially now that our votes will have influence on whether or not we get relief. What do you need to communicate to us regarding what's going on with the
Well,
future
first, I'd like to say that Mass Restaurant United is an organization that's been created by independents, by a board of really key heavy hitters in Boston, but specifically focused on independent organizations. So like Tony Maz, Jody Adams, Jamie Bissonette, Ken Orange, or, several individuals who really felt it was important to connect and start kind of telling our own stories, because in our business, at times egos become a part of this, and we're not often so open to just discuss our vulnerabilities or our concerns, right? We're not sitting here saying like, hey, we're operating at a negative this month, or like, hey, I have $24 in my bank account, if that's what it was. I listened to one podcast from an entrepreneur, restaurateur that I admire, and listening to that story, I was like, wow, this is crazy. What was the
podcast? I don't mind sharing other podcasts.
Yeah. I spend a lot of time with Speaking Broadly. And Dana spends a lot of time interviewing different restaurateurs. And in this particular case, she was interviewing a couple of different guys from the South, and they were talking about their challenges financially raising money and where they were at when COVID actually hit.
Yeah.
I also have spent some time, I'm a big fan of the Welcome Conference, so I've been listening to
Yep.
Will Guidara.
Yep.
And
he just started that podcast like around like 2 months or 3 months ago.
yeah,
Right?
and Takeaway was a part of that too piece, like on that same podcast. But one of my favorite restaurateurs is Caroline's down out in California, and she was talking about her challenges with her restaurant group out there, and the ups and downs of the peaks of COVID that she's been experiencing. And some of her restaurants are sitting dormant, others have opened, and what she's doing. But it's been very open conversation about, the challenges that we have. And we didn't really have that going into COVID. I think, if you had a relationship with somebody that you felt comfortable texting and asking, like, hey, did I screw this up, or is this normal, whatever, I think that there was that coaching and mentorship if you had that relationship or like that connection to a certain group. But, it wasn't something that we were openly talking about.
I mean, that's why I started this podcast. Because I was listening to all these entrepreneurs sharing their advice about how they're making money online and doing all this stuff. But me being so like in love with the restaurant industry, growing up in the restaurant industry, I was like, why do we hold our information so close to our chest?
Yeah.
And I've found there's definitely a trend that it's the people who are the most generous with their knowledge and are willing to share and grow people and to pay it forward that are the most successful, because they create success. We think that we are in the business of creating food, but we're in the business of creating people,
right?
Developing people and building teams around us. And that's why those people always go on to go do other things. But sometimes you get to retain those people,
right?
So anyway, digress, but
no. And I think that's a big part of, even continuing to listen to your podcast too. My drive home from Boston more often than not is listening to a podcast just to decompress, or, to listen to something that could potentially relate to something that I went through that day or in that week. But Mass Restaurant United was very much an organization that caught my eye because, for the first time, a lot of people were openly sharing their concerns and their challenges, and it set a tone for, me personally to feel comfortable being able to share my story, right? And to listen to different restaurants in different parts of the state that were going through challenges right now. And I feel like Mass Restaurant United is something that a lot of independents should know about in the state, but also just the independent restaurant coalition that's happening on a more national level that like Tom Colicchio and everybody's a part of in that way. But, we have been in an industry that's been wildly affected over the last couple of years. And, whether it's credit card, fees that have been happening, accelerated rents that are happening, additional EMAC, insurance responsibilities that we have for employees that we have to pay into, like all that starts to take away from our bottom line. And we've never necessarily had the ability to talk about it openly and say why, or like, what's the long term on this, or, we want to give our employees health insurance, but that's another drawing factor out of our bottom line. And, to be able to come to the table and have a conversation for an industry that is such a huge part of our country, now's the time to do it. And so Mass Restaurant United is starting to create this open conversation, now very much focused on the COVID piece and the relief action that we need in order to get out of this. But we hope to continue the organization in a way that we can provide information that people need, and ultimately give them guidance and listen to their hardships or their successes and try to circulate it.
I love it, and I definitely can support that. That's what we're all about, for sure. So anything I can do to help spread the word. But what I want to know is what are you guys trying to tell people to do? Like, what do we need to know? I think this, like, should we be voting a certain way? Like, what, like, will that influence things? Like, what do we need to know?
Well, we do know that the Relief Act currently was put into the HEROES Act that unfortunately got put on a pause from Donald Trump earlier this week, when he basically said that he was not going to do anything until he's elected. I think that we kind of all knew that the relief or that would come to our industry was going to have to be after the election. At least I personally had gotten there too. I just felt like, okay, this is going to be like, not for another couple of weeks. But what we're looking for is for people to just take a second and email their story. You know, if it's to email their story to us so we can hear what they've got going on and we can be their voice, we're happy to do that.
Yeah.
And people can reach out to me and share that story with me. I'm happy to.
Yeah.
We're constantly looking as an organization for more stories to share that hopefully will make a connection with somebody. We're asking them to connect with, you know, their local legislature and send emails either with that same story or just the ask to consider to talk about it. You know, I think that we're basically, you know, advocating for our lives right now. And if it's to advocate for just my own, I feels like it wouldn't be, it would be selfish. So we just want to help each other out as much as possible and get everybody out there.
See, one thought I have, and I've never been somebody who's huge in following politics or even just law in general. I'm not an organized mind. I don't think systems, processes, procedures has never really been my thing. I do think that this industry is there's a lot of burden on the industry with systems and regulations that increase our operational expenses. And I do wonder sometimes if people right now are so worried about, you know, voting a certain way to get a certain, like everyone's saying vote. For the record, I'm very moderate, but I lean right because I believe that we don't necessarily need to lean on laws and regulations. I think we have an issue with culture,
right?
And that we can improve culture.
I can understand that.
Yeah. And I worry that if we are just reacting to get relief right now, if we go too far left, is our industry going to get way overregulated? That you need to be a millionaire to even get into the industry because of how expensive it is, because of the liabilities you have. Like, I mean, those are some of my concerns. I don't know if that plays in now or.
I think that the challenging part too is like, you know, there's so many of us that are connected to, you know, the everyday of government, right?
Yeah.
And then it's not until there's peaks of elections that we start to get very curious and start advocating and start getting after it. I find that right now it's really challenging with both candidates, to be honest. You know, I'm not seeing, I'm not having a positive reaction to Donald Trump, and I'm not having a positive reaction to Joe Biden. And then I think about their seconds in commands and what happens there, right? I mean, even with risky business, with, you know, Donald Trump contracting COVID this week, you know, it's just like, okay, fear of the unknown. What happens next? You know, and like, but. You know, I said this earlier to you, probably while not where we were taping, but, you know, I had high hopes that with electing Donald Trump into office, potentially he would have like humanized the ability to just become a president, you know, and there'd be somebody who would step up, like the candidates that we've had in the past. And, you know, I mean, I'm just hoping that, you know, people aren't living in fear of taking this position on. I mean, it can't be easy, whomever takes it on, right?
No.
And we talk about Baker locally in our state for, you know, how he's performing as our governor, and if he's, you know, being too strict, and if he should just open it up. And, you know, I can't imagine waking up to the idea of a pandemic and how to manage it. And I'm sure anybody, whether it's Trump, you know, or Baker, is sitting here and saying, like, I wanted to sign up to manage I don't think anybody would have succeeded in that.
Forget that.
Yeah. But I do think that, you know, I'm trying to do and make, you know, make clear decisions on people that I think I can trust, and people that I think can, that care, and people that want to make a difference. And I think that's what whoever's listening to this before election, if it comes out before then, I hope that that's the route that you go, right? It's not just about like whether or not you want to be a Republican or be a Democrat. I think we just have to get people out to vote.
Yeah, I think too often people are voting for a person and they forget that it's a greater picture. It's not just a person. There's a greater picture. And I don't know. I don't need to make this a political podcast.
No, and I just wish there was a lot more honesty in it, you know, because media plays a big part in it, and then you starts weighing on you as, you know, a whole toll, because you're just like sitting here thinking like, okay, is this the truth? Is that the truth? Is that fact, or is this the fact? Like,
I think the truth is it's all true.
Yeah.
But that's the world we live in.
Right.
That it's not black and white. That it's circumstantial. That almost all the time, both sides have rational thoughts or have reasonable ways of thinking. It's about finding a balance, you know? Anyway, I think we've had a great conversation. I love this conversation. Thank you for creating awareness about Mass Restaurants United. It's really great stuff what you guys are doing. One question I asked before we go to the speed round is the mission statement is to inspire, empower, and transform the industry. How have you personally transformed over the, say, 10 years since going into business for yourself?
I'd say that I've transformed just in a way that I'm not trying to take myself so seriously. You know, like I'm trying to find the fun in the business, especially now when it's so intense. And I think that I want to make a change that ultimately other people can succeed from.
We're back, and the first question I have for you is, what is your it factor? A habit, a trait, a characteristic you believe most contributes to your success?
My time spent with myself all by myself.
Yes. What is your biggest weakness?
Probably that I'd say probably that I give too many people too many chances.
What is one thing you look for or question you ask when you're growing your team? And I remember I know you listened to your episode, so you remember your question from the last time too.
I think so. I'm right now, I often just ask people what they're eating and drinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you looking for anything in particular?
No, I just want them to just talk, because again, I think that synergy is so important. Like I want to come in and be like, "Where'd you go eat? What'd you go do?" You know, because that's what I'm doing. So I want to connect in that way too. You know.
What is your biggest challenge today?
My biggest challenge today is, I think, continuing to grow loyalty. I think when it comes to diners and making them, you know, connected to us as a form of, as instead of, you know, Instagramming, here I am and it's hot and awesome, and tomorrow I'm going here because it's hot and awesome. Like, I think there's an opportunity now to just grow loyalty from your staff, but also with your guests.
I love it. Share one code of conduct or behavior you teach your team. This is a core value, a way to be, a way to act.
A way to be, a way to act. Maybe just positive and positive energy. I think they'd say that about me. Like I often talk about, like, the energy you put out is what you're going to get in. And like, if you come in like, you know, guns blazing and you're in a bad mood, nobody's going to come out of the day feeling positive and energized.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Like attracts like.
Yeah.
For sure. What is one book that's a must read to make us a better person or a restaurant owner? The last time you were on the show, you recommended Danny Meyer, Setting the Table. What else?
I've been reading so many books lately.
You have the time, finally.
Yeah, I do. I do. And honestly, I've kind of given up on TV, and a little bit of media just burns me out.
Right.
But, you know, I also use a lot of 1 Minute Manager when it comes to my team. He does a lot of writing, and I think it's super important that, you know, people can pick up something quickly that they can kind of go back to in our industry and, like, kind of, I don't know, refer to it. So I think it's important to have those, like, quick little books. But also, you know, a lot of the conversations with Not to Talk to Strangers and, like, all that kind of emotional intelligence really has me going.
That was a great book.
Yeah.
His name's escaping me, obviously.
Yeah. It's escaping me, too. Because I was going to introduce it as that.
I want to say Seth Godin. I know it's not Seth Godin.
Yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell. All of his books are incredible. Talking to Strangers is a really good book. What was the biggest lesson you got from that book?
Well, I find that the emotional intelligence piece just kind of gets me going, really, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like, I just feel like I've listened to him on podcasts with, like, Super Soul with Oprah, and, like, his way of, like, breaking down how we transfer information is so important to me. I don't know.
I think, sorry, did I cut you short?
No, go ahead.
Well, one of the things I think is huge from that book is that I love human nature, because we don't realize how much human nature affects business. Because what do we say? Business is all about relationships.
Right.
So we need to know how people function and work to understand what's going on. And I think that there's just a lot of, like, we live in a world today that we never meant to live in. We never evolved to live in this current style of, like, I don't know, humanity, where there's just so many people where we have access to so much information, and it's overwhelming, right? And I think that we generalize so much, and I think we have to, because how else are we all going to know it all? There's so much to know today, right? Yeah. To be politically correct, to be considerate of everybody.
Oh, it's heavy.
We have to remember that if somebody is ignorant, maybe they're not trying to be an asshole or a jerk. Maybe they just don't know. Right. And that we tend to think that 2 or 3 people represent an entire group of people. And that those 2 or 3 people usually are the ones that we assume others are like. So we have to keep in mind that, like, you just have to have an open mind constantly. You have to really just try to understand. First seek to understand, then seek to be understood, right? I think that's a really good takeaway from that book, is to not generalize, to know that we have innate flaws as being humans, and just to try to understand. Yeah.
You know, I was also just thinking, as you're talking about that, like, Simon Sinek, he's super interesting TED talker, as well as he's got a book that he just put out. But, you know, one of the things he was talking about was how he was speaking he was with like he was not speaking for Apple. He was doing a conversation with like one of their he was doing a TED Talk with one of their competitors, and he got in a car with one of the executives of this company, and he started sharing the idea that, you know, he really liked the Apple product versus his, and the executive like never like went to that negative place with him. He was like, yeah, they're a great company and they're really productive. And like, it just became this, again, this collaborative piece of like conversation versus he was like, I wasn't really sure what I was trying to get out of that, you know, to have them speak negatively about the company or whatever. But the interest was that, you know, he was surprised that he decided at that point to say, oh, I really like another product versus your own. Instead, the response was positive and like, yeah, they do a good job.
Yeah,
you know?
I love it. I love it. What is one thing you feel restaurateurs don't do well enough or often enough?
I think that we don't take enough time to reflect on our day-to-day.
Absolutely. And name one service you've hired or outsourced. So this is something that is generally a humans behind the service. You know, it's not a technology, it's not a system that you're plugging into your business, but somebody you're outsourcing to do a job for you. Who is that organization?
I have a woman in town called One Oak, and she does a really good job with a lot of HR-related conversations. She is working with a lot of independent different industries, but a lot of independent business owners to just kind of help with, especially now with like PPP stuff, general conversation about, you know, progressive discipline, just the nitty gritty of stuff where you realize like I could use a second to just have a conversation with somebody about if I did this right or did this wrong, because it's super scary.
But the purpose of this question is to help good people connect with good people. So that was One Oak. PR, is that the name?
HR.
Thank you. One Oak HR. And this is not quite the last question. We're almost there though. What is one piece of technology you've recently adopted within your organization that has had a huge impact on communication, efficiency, profitability, anything along those lines?
I mean, I guess I feel like we've plugged them, but 7 shifts, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, and listen, like, you know, we've talked about them throughout the conversation today, but we spent a lot of time looking at other companies. You know, I tasked our management team for each one of them to pick one and find it and then kind of come together. And we've seen them grow significantly, but the most important part that I find with 7 shifts, as opposed to maybe the others, granted I didn't get into a contractual business with them, but was their service, especially their late night service, because that's so important, right? We're not in a business that's 9 to 5. And so most of the times when things crash, it's typically at a time where most are sleeping. So you're just like, oh man, I need to be able to, you know, fix this problem, or like, I need to be able to do my log and the system's like, you know.
And that's huge. I think a lot of time when we're researching or doing our shopping for these tools and services, we just look at the price, right? And we forget that like when the shit hits the fan, which is gonna happen. Like you need that customer support, and it might be an extra whatever dollars a month, but you're gonna get that back. Look, how much business you're gonna lose when that thing's not working, how many balls you're gonna drop when something doesn't work the way it's supposed to, you know? So you really have to weigh into those things, and there's a lot of options out there when it comes to labor management. So.
And nobody wants to start their day already fixing a problem. You know, it's better to wrap the day with a problem fixed. So if like, you know, it happens at 9 o'clock at night, I know you know, it's unfortunate because somebody else, you know, the person who could be on call for that call has to take the call, but it's better, I think, to wrap the issue, fix it, versus like starting in the morning and it's everybody's problem, right?
And just for the record, I vet my sponsors, and I really try to make sure that I go after sponsors that are being recommended on the show, because if I'm going to be promoting a product or service, I want it to be something that's going to help our listeners. So guys, please use our links, or let these sponsors know it's Restaurant Unstoppable that's turning you on, because that you have no idea how much that supports the show. If we're sending people their way and they're loving the product, like they will continue to support the show, and we can grow this sucker and take it to the next level. So thank you for using my links in advance. And this is the last question. If you got the news, you'd be leaving this world tomorrow. All the memories of you, your work, and your restaurants would be lost with your departure, with the exception of 3 pieces of wisdom that you could leave behind for the good of humanity and for your legacy. What would those 3 pieces of wisdom be?
So one of them I'd say is still be you. Like, live this life for yourself. Don't necessarily let it be like this industry be your whole life, or like any business work that you do. You know, you need to have your sense of independence away from everything that you're doing every day. Like, a lot of times I find that struggle where, you know, everybody just knows me as my restaurants, but I still am who I am, right?
Be you.
Be you. The second one I'd say is Lead with intention. Set those intentions weekly, daily, whatever it may be, short goals, long-term goals, but like daily affirmations and intentions are super important. And I would say continue to do that.
Number 3.
And number 3, I'd say, I'd have to be around food or drink. Like I'd have to like find a way to like, leave everybody with a place where they can have really great food and really great drink and maybe give a list of where to go to eat and drink.
So be well, live intentionally, eat well. That's good, right? This has been an incredible conversation.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for coming back on the show for a second time and really helping me take this podcast in the direction I want it to go with. Like we talked about, like it's not about how many relationships you have. It's about reinforcing those relationships you already have, right? And going stronger. You helped me do that today by coming back on the show. Thank you so much. And how can we connect if we want to come join your team or anything like that?
Caswell Restaurants, with a plural, Caswell Restaurants is always definitely the best way to reach out to us. It links you to all of our restaurants. It also links you to like personal Instagram and social media outlets. So if people want to get in touch that way. Yep.
And I'm not sure what episode number this is going to be, so stick around for the closing thoughts. I'll drop that on you. The last time you were on the show, you called out Barbara Lynch and Joanne Chang. I have not gotten either of them on the show, but I've been in contact with both of them. Yeah. So I'm still going for it. It just hasn't worked. Barbara and her people actually agreed, but want to wait until after COVID. So maybe this will be my cue to tap her on the shoulder again. I'd love to make that happen. And I think that's that. So this is where I say thank you so much. And there is no questioning, Nancy. You are unstoppable.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers.